So today in this class we shall move on and continue with the next topic of our chapter, that is pollination. Pollination is the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. We have already seen the structure of a pollen grain and how it is formed. So now we can understand how it is. So the transfer of pollen grain from the anther is one part of the male reproductive part, and the stigma the is a part of the female reproductive part of a flower. So the transfer of the pollen grain the transfer of the pollen grain the transfer of the pollen grain from this anther to the stigma of the pistil is known as the pollination. So this is a stigma. So pollination, it is of two types. They are of two types. Number one is the self-pollination. And self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of a same flower. So in self-pollination, the flower has to be a bisexual flower. The flower has to be a bisexual flower. So transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of a same flower, that is self-pollination. So self-pollinations also are of two types. The first one is Gitanogami. And Gitanogami is the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of a same flower. So transfer of pollen grain of a same flower. So basically this is a flower, and this is the thalamus. So Gitanogami, the flower should be a bisexual flower. So this flower, it should have a female reproductive part and a male reproductive part. In that way, it will undergo self-pollination. The second type of self-pollination is Gitanogami. Gitanogami is the transfer of pollen grain from anther of one flower anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Suppose this is a plant. This is a flower. This also is a flower. So the transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower, to the stigma of another flower of the same plant, is known as Gitanogami, which falls under self-pollination. But autogamy is the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther of the same flower to the stigma of the same flower. And then autogamy should be a bisexual flower. The next type of pollination is known as the cross-pollination. Pollination. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, may it be of the same species, may it be of the same species or different species. But in cross-pollination, since it is a transfer of pollen grain from the anther of one flower to the anther of another flower of another plant of the same species, of another flower of another plant made of the same species, so we can say that here agents are required for transfer. Agents are required for transfer. Example of these agents is water, wind, insects, birds, etc. So a cross-pollination is the transfer of the pollen grain from one plant. Suppose here is a plant A, and then suppose here is a plant A to the stigma of another flower of plant B. This is another flower, this is another flower. So the transfer of this pollen grain from one flower of another plant to the stigma of another flower of another plant is known as cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is also known as xenogamy or Self-Pollination. So in our next class, we shall continue about the silent features of a self-pollination, the silent features of cross-pollination, and what it is called when pollens are carried out by water or by wind or by insects.